Damon Fletcher had always been a man who avoided trouble. His life was built on a carefully structured framework, with no room for surprises or adventure. But that didn't matter when Officer Erica Manning walked into the convenience store one quiet afternoon in Fort Worth, Texas. The store was nearly empty. Damon had stopped by to pick up a coffee and a snack before heading home. He'd just left the self-checkout counter when a chill ran down his spine. A sense of unease. Someone was watching him. "Sir, stop right there." The sharp, authoritative voice made Damon turn around. A female police officer stood before him, her hand resting lightly on the butt of her gun. Erica Manning. Her eyes were sharp as knives, scanning the store as if for confirmation. "Is there a problem?" Damon asked, trying to keep his voice even. Manning didn't answer right away. She looked at him as if she had already made up her mind. "I just saw you put something in your pocket after scanning a few items. Can I see your receipt?" Damon frowned, shifting his bag to his other hand. "I just paid, you can check the register." Manning's lips pressed into a thin line. "I said show me your receipt." Damon took a slow breath, trying not to make the situation more tense. He reached into the plastic bag, pulled out the receipt, and handed it to her. Carefully. Calmly. But Manning just glanced at the paper and shook her head. "Good. Now, empty your pockets." Around them, a few people were starting to notice. Eyes watching, waiting. Like this was a game. Damon clenched his jaw. He knew this. Had seen it too many times, in too many places. She didn't check the receipt. She had already decided. He looked her straight in the eye. "I don't have anything in my pocket." Manning's patience was gone in an instant. She stepped forward, quick as a flash, and slapped him across the face. A searing pain spread across her cheek. A gasp rang out from the people around her. And then, before Damon could react, cold handcuffs were locked around his wrists. "You're under arrest for theft." Damon's heart pounded in his chest. He had done nothing wrong. He knew that. But would anyone believe him? Manning was sure no one would doubt her. But when Damon walked into the courtroom the next morning, her heart sank. She had been wrong. And perhaps, the biggest mistake of her career. Damon walked into the convenience store, trying not to draw attention. He just needed a few things, a quick snack, a bottle of water. But as he approached the counter, an unfamiliar feeling crept into his mind. Not because of the looks from the cashier or the other customers, but because of something else. An invisible tension. "I told you I didn't take anything," he said, keeping his voice even as the security guard's eyes trained on him. Officer Manning, who was standing nearby, tapped the radio on her shoulder. "I have a suspect who may be a shoplifter." Her voice was cold, unwavering. Damon held his breath. This was happening again. Defying conformity, defying conformity. Manning's voice boomed as she approached. Damon didn't move. His breathing slowed, his eyes falling to his hands. None of that mattered. Not the first time. Not the last. A store clerk, a young man in a business suit, hesitated before stepping forward. Actually, I saw him pay for everything." Manning didn't even turn around. "Stay out of this." Damon's heart pounded in his chest. He could see where this was going. "Look, you're making a mistake," he said, his voice still calm, but this time there was a sharp edge to his words. "I have a law degree, and I know my rights." Manning let out a short laugh. He had no sense of humor. "Well, you can explain your rights downtown." Before Damon could answer, she grabbed his wrist. For a brief moment, her fingers tightened. A choice flashed through his mind. He could ask to see the supervisor. Fighting. But nothing good came of it. So he let her put the cold metal handcuffs on his wrists. A clicking sound rang out, sending a ripple of tension through the small shop. Manning's grip was firm as she led him outside, where her patrol car was waiting. As he stepped out of the shop, Damon caught sight of his reflection in the glass door. He'd seen plenty of people in this position before. But this time, for the first time, he was one of them. However, there was one thing he knew that Erica Manning didn't. This wasn't going to end the way she thought it would. The ride to the police station was silent, save for the occasional crackle of the radio. Damon sat in the back seat, handcuffed, staring out the window. The city passed by in a blur of streetlights, strangers. He knew better than to say anything. Anything he said could be twisted, misinterpreted, used against him. Manning, on the other hand, seemed relaxed. One hand on the wheel, the other resting near the radio. She had done this before. Too many times to count. When they reached the station, she parked with a determined look on her face. The door opened, and the air grew heavier. Damon took a deep breath. He had been prepared for this. Damon emerged from the cramped room with his head held high, knowing full well the cold eyes on him. His jaw was clenched, his body rigid as a reflex to contain the simmering anger. The officers in the station barely glanced at him, as if this were just a routine arrest, nothing to worry about. Manning walked ahead, leading him past the reception desk. A female officer was taking notes, only looking up briefly as Damon walked past. "Petty shoplifting," Manning said casually, handing Damon's wallet and belongings to the officer on duty. The man behind the counter, who looked tired of the job, glanced at Damon and then at Manning with disdain. "What a waste of time." Manning shrugged. "He's hostile." Damon clenched his fists. "Hostile?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. The word, when applied to someone like him, could mean something else entirely. A young officer, perhaps in his early 30s, flipped through Damon's wallet and pulled out a card. He glanced up. "You're a lawyer." Damon exhaled through his nose. "Yes." Manning snorted. "Sure." The young officer narrowed his eyes, realizing Damon wasn't lying. He looked at Manning. "Are you sure about this charge?" Manning's lips twitched, his face tense. "He took it from the store." The young officer hesitated, then looked at Damon. "Do you need a lawyer?" Damon looked him straight in the eye. "I don't." The silence stretched for a few seconds. Then a smile flickered across the officer's face, an almost amused smile. He glanced at Manning before placing the card back in Damon's wallet. "So you're going to defend yourself?" Damon nodded, certain. Manning let out a short, annoyed sentence, then turned on his heel. "Okay. Deal with him." Damon was led down the hall, past the rows of cells. The air was damp and the smell of sweat was heavy. He had seen these places before, but from the other side of the barrier. Now he was behind bars. He sat down on the bench, silently watching the minutes tick by. He knew how the system worked. They would keep him as long as they could, as long as was legal. They wanted to pressure him, want him to plead guilty, or worse, let him rot in his cell for the weekend, a reminder that even a lawyer couldn't escape the law. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. The cell door creaked open. A guard entered, his voice low and firm. "You'll be tried tomorrow morning." Damon nodded, his mind racing through the loopholes of his strategy. He wasn't just going to prove his innocence, he was going to make sure no one else had to go through this again. No one else was going to be mistaken, pushed into a corner because the system needed a guilty man to convict. But Manning. She thought she'd won. She believed this was a simple arrest, a normal day at work. She had no idea how wrong she was. The courtroom was colder than he'd expected. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed uncomfortably, casting a harsh light on the polished wood of the judge's bench. Damon sat at the defense table, his hands clasped together. Though he'd been uncuffed the night before, the tightness was still burned into his wrists like invisible scars. Across the room, Officer Erica Manning stood tall, her face cold. Her uniform was immaculate, unwrinkled. Her gaze was emotionless, as if this were just a repetitive process, another thief caught, another case closed. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes, adjusted her glasses and scanned the file. Her voice was stern and uncompromising. "Let us proceed. What are the charges?" The prosecutor, a young man with a smug smile, stood up. "Your Honor, the defendant Damon Fletcher was caught shoplifting from a local convenience store. Officer Manning was an eyewitness and made the arrest when the defendant refused to cooperate." Damon let out a small breath, almost a smirk. The deception had begun, as he had expected. The judge turned to him. "Mr. Fletcher, do you have legal representation?" Damon rose slowly, buttoning his suit jacket with steady hands. "Your Honor, I will represent myself." A murmur spread from the back row. Even the prosecutor lost a bit of his complacency, but Manning, she remained motionless. Not surprised, not confused, as if she had seen this before, or as if she didn't think it would make a difference. The judge nodded. "Very well. Mr. Fletcher, do you plead guilty or not?" "Not guilty." Damon's voice was steady, without a hint of hesitation. The judge turned to the prosecutor. "All right, let me hear the officer's statement." Manning stepped forward, her tone firm and confident. "Your Honor, I was on patrol that night when I entered the convenience store. I saw the defendant put an item in his pocket without paying. When I approached him and asked to see a receipt, he was unable to provide one and appeared to be resisting." Damon tilted his head, his eyes fixed on Manning. "Is that so?" he said, not loudly but sharply enough to make some of the people in the room flinch. He was ready. This time, the truth would come out. Damon tilted his head slightly, a gesture that was fleeting but filled with confusion and sarcasm. He had heard baseless accusations before, but this one was especially sloppy. He closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, then opened them with a sharp calm. The judge turned to him, his voice stern. "Mr. Fletcher, you may begin cross-examination." Damon stood, adjusting his tie slowly, almost deliberately, to emphasize his confidence. He stepped forward, his hands resting lightly on the defense table. His sharp eyes scanned the courtroom, then stopped on the man standing in the witness stand. "Officer Manning," Damon's voice was calm but weighty, "you said you saw me take an item and put it in my pocket?" Manning swallowed slightly before answering. "Yes." "And you claim I did not produce a receipt?" "Yes." Damon nodded, an unreadable interest in his eyes. "Were there security cameras in the store?" Manning hesitated. It was only a split second, but Damon caught it. "Yes, but the footage has not been reviewed yet." Damon turned to the prosecutor, his voice calm. "Did your office request the footage?" The prosecutor shifted slightly, looking uncomfortable. "No, because at the time, it was not considered necessary." Damon was silent for a moment, letting those words sink into the tense atmosphere in the courtroom. Then he turned back to Manning. "Officer Manning, you also said that I refused to comply. In what way?" Manning raised his head, his voice firmer. "You became aggressive, refused to empty your pockets when asked, and resisted my attempts to restrain you." Damon pursed his lips, his nod not of interest but of understanding this time. He looked Manning straight in the eye, then turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I would like to present Exhibit A, my purchase receipt, which was in my possession at the time of my arrest." He walked up to the bailiff, handing over the neatly folded paper. The judge opened it, her eyes narrowing slightly as she scanned the contents. Her eyebrows rose, a clear sign of surprise. "This receipt shows that Mr. Fletcher did in fact pay for all of his items," her voice boomed, and she glanced over her glasses at Manning. "Officer, did you check this at the time of arrest?" Manning stiffened slightly. Maybe I missed it. Damon chuckled. You must have missed it. The room fell silent. The silence wasn't just a gap between words, it was a tension that hung heavy in the air. Manning's jaw tightened, but Damon didn't stop. Officer, do you have any body camera footage of the arrest? Manning hesitated again. My body camera malfunctioned. The judge's eyes narrowed further. You didn't mention that in your report. Damon crossed his arms, his voice sharp but deadly calm. So, no body camera footage. No security footage reviewed. And I have a receipt to prove my innocence. Manning clenched his fists, but he said nothing more. The truth was before everyone's eyes. Damon didn't need to say more. He stepped back, his eyes fixed on the judge, and nodded slightly. In that moment, he knew that the truth wasn't just heard, it was felt. He chuckled, his tone not angry, just a gentle mockery mixed with uneasy confidence. Officer Manning, are you sure I stole something? Or did you just decide I looked like one? A sharp intake of breath filled the room. Manning's face was flushed. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. She didn't need to look around to know that every eye in the courtroom was on her. But this was only the beginning. The real unraveling was about to begin. A heavy silence fell, as if the room were holding its breath in anticipation. Manning stood rigid, her face expressionless, but Damon could see the tension in her jaw, the slight shift in her weight from foot to foot. She had expected a quick trial, a rubber-stamped verdict, no arguments, no doubts. But now, the floor was crumbling beneath her. Damon kept his tone calm, controlled. Officer Manning, let's get back to your report. You said I was hostile and resisting compliance. Manning lifted his chin slightly, determination flashing in his eyes. Yes. He nodded slightly, as if fully expecting that answer. Can you describe exactly what I did that was hostile? She hesitated for only a second. But right now, a second was more than enough to notice the hesitation. You refused to empty your pockets. You raised your voice. Damon tilted his head, as if considering something. I see. Raising my voice after being falsely accused, that counts as hostility. Manning didn't answer. Damon turned back to look at the judge. Your Honor, I would like to present Exhibit B, video testimony from a store clerk who witnessed the entire encounter. The prosecutor immediately rose from his chair, his voice as sharp as a knife. Objection. This witness is not to be disclosed at trial. The judge waved his hand dismissively, his voice calm but firm. Listen to it. The bailiff pressed the play button. On the screen at the front of the courtroom, a grainy video appeared. A young clerk sat at a desk, his eyes darting nervously as he spoke. I saw everything. The man, Damon Fletcher, paid for his things at the self-checkout. Then the police officer walked in. She looked at him for a second and walked straight toward him. She didn't even check the security footage. She just assumed. Silence filled the courtroom. Damon studied Manning's face. She stiffened, her hands clasped behind her back. But her eyes only blinked for a second, a split second that held a realization. Damon turned to Officer Manning, his tone no longer mocking, only matter-of-fact. Did you bother to ask the clerk what he saw? Anger simmered in Damon's chest, but he kept his face composed. He couldn't let emotions get the best of him right now. Manning stood across from him, her police uniform still straight, but her expression wavered. Her piercing blue eyes stared at him, but there was something in them, a little worry, a little doubt. I think you made up your mind the moment you saw me, Damon said, his voice low but carrying the weight of suppressed anger. Manning's jaw clenched. You committed a crime. A vein in her temple twitched, a small sign of confusion that Damon didn't miss. That's not what happened. Damon shook his head slowly. Let's break it down. There's no security footage. No body cam video. No witness testimony. It's just your word against mine. He paused, then pulled a piece of paper from his jacket pocket. Except now, I have a receipt. I have a witness. He turned to the judge. Your Honor, I request a review of Officer Manning's previous arrest records. The prosecutor's chair scraped against the floor. Objection. That's not relevant to this case. Damon's lips curled into a faint smile. I think it's extremely relevant. If Officer Manning has a history of wrongful arrest, that would directly impact the credibility of her testimony today. The judge studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Motion granted. Attention filled the air. The prosecutor leaned back in his chair, his face showing his displeasure. Damon crossed his arms, his sharp gaze fixed on Manning. Officer Manning, do you have a history of wrongful arrest? Her face paled. No. Damon tilted his head, slowly, as if contemplating his answer. Because the public record shows you've had 3 complaints of racial discrimination in the last 2 years. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Manning's fingers twitched at her sides, but she tried to keep her composure. Damon continued, his voice calm but with the edge of a scalpel. How many of those cases involved black men? There was a long pause. No one spoke. Manning bit her lip, then finally spoke, her voice strained. Not related to this case. Is it? Damon raised his eyebrows, defiant. She shifted slightly, her gaze flicking to the prosecutor, but the man only rubbed his temples, clearly regretting bringing this case to trial. Damon let the silence linger for a long moment, letting everyone in the courtroom feel the weight of the truth that had just been revealed. Then he looked straight at the judge. Your Honor, it is now clear that not only was I wrongfully arrested, but Officer Manning acted with bias and negligence. I move to dismiss this case immediately. The judge did not hesitate. Motion granted. Case dismissed. Damon exhaled, a sense of victory filling his chest. But he knew that this was no small victory. Some victories meant more than a single case. And Officer Manning, and the system she represented, were about to learn that. The gavel came down with a decisive, certain thud. Manning barely moved. She stood still, her shoulders still, but Damon could see the subtle change in her eyes. A realization was creeping in, the truth was seeping through her steely veneer. She had entered this courtroom with confidence, expecting a swift verdict, as she had so often done. But this time, she was the one being scrutinized. Damon adjusted his suit jacket gently. His every move was carefully measured, without haste or gloating. He was not a man who liked to be smug, but he was not one to let injustice pass easily. As he gathered his things, the judge's authoritative voice cut through the tension. Before we conclude, Officer Manning, I need to address one issue. Manning was startled. For the first time during the trial, she lost her composure. Yes, sir, she replied, her voice quieter, lacking the familiar certainty. The judge removed her glasses, setting them down slowly on the table. Her gaze was fixed on Manning, pondering the fate of a woman who had once stood in a different position, a position of power. The court does not take allegations of misconduct lightly. And Mr. Fletcher's case raises serious concerns. Damon watched as Manning's face paled. Given the circumstances, I am formally requesting an internal investigation into your actions, not only in this case, but in previous complaints as well. The air in the room froze. Damon could see Manning's hands clenched at her sides, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. Your Honor, that is unnecessary, Manning began, but her protest was quickly cut off. The judge raised his hand, not giving her a chance to continue. It's not your decision, she said bluntly, then turned to the law enforcement officer. Make sure the parties involved get my recommendation. Damon looked at Manning, saw her swallowing, her eyes no longer as sharp and confident as before. He took a step forward, keeping his voice calm but heavy. "Officer Manning, you are so certain of my guilt that you don't bother to check the facts. You let your bias decide everything." Manning didn't respond. Damon continued, his voice still calm, but there was a fierce undercurrent beneath it. "I may have lost my job, my reputation, even my freedom because of your unfairness. But I have a chance to fight back, because I have the knowledge, the means." He paused, letting the words sink in. Then he tilted his head, his eyes sharp. "But what about the others?" Manning's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to object, but no words came out. Damon shook his head slightly, looking at her knowingly. "How many people who look like me have you arrested? How many of them are not fit to defend themselves?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. The door to the courtroom opened slowly, making a shrill sound in the gloomy atmosphere. The cold fluorescent lights cast a shadow over the dark suit of the man who had just entered, highlighting the hard lines of his expressionless face. He was an officer of the police department, a man with power and a predetermined sentence. He exchanged a few brief words with the bailiff, his voice low but as cold as a knife. Then he stepped closer to the judge's chair, his shadow looming over the room like a heavy nightmare. The judge nodded, his face expressionless, but his voice carrying an invisible authority as he announced. "Officer Manning, you are hereby placed on administrative leave, effective immediately, until the investigation is completed." A shiver ran down the spines of everyone present. The room suddenly became as heavy as a tomb. Manning's face stiffened, shock and rage overlapping, pushing her to the brink of collapse. Her lips trembled slightly, her eyes wide with panic. "No, it can't be." Her voice cracked, almost pleading, but no one answered. Damon stood silently, his every breath carrying a cruel pleasure. It wasn't the arrest, but this was enough to crush Manning. Heavy footsteps echoed as she was escorted out of the courtroom. Each step felt like a nail being driven into her fate. Her face was pale, her eyes wild with the realization of her utter helplessness. When the door closed behind her, a cold silence fell. Damon bent down to pick up his leather briefcase, his fingers brushing the soft leather. This wasn't just a personal victory, this was a delicate balance between justice and corruption. A rare day when the system was forced to confront the very ghosts it had harbored for so long. He stepped out of the courthouse. The sun was beating down, but he felt that something was different in the air today. Lighter. Clearer. Not because the world had changed, but because maybe, just maybe, someone had been forced to see it differently. Damon walked slowly down the steps, his mind still processing everything that had happened. The accusation, the court battle, Manning's fall. A small victory, but an important step in the war that no one dared to name. "Mr. Fletcher." He stopped, turning to look at the caller. A young cop from the station ran up, his uniform still pressed but his eyes filled with too much hesitation. Damon recognized him. The one who had hesitated when Manning brandished his badge. The one who had seen the truth, before anyone else had admitted it. The cop stopped a few feet away, breathing hard. I just wanted to say, what you did there." Damon raised an eyebrow, waiting. He swallowed, scratching the back of his neck. "I mean, I've seen this happen too many times. People pushed through the system, crushed because they can't fight back. It happens more than it should. But I've never seen anyone turn the tables, not in a courtroom." Damon stared at him for a moment. The wind blew the last of the afternoon sunlight away. Then he smirked, not a smile, just the bland reaction of someone who's all too familiar with the darkness of this world. "Remember that," he said, his voice low but sharp. "And be ready when it's your turn." The young cop swallowed, not sure whether to feel encouraged or threatened. Damon turned away, leaving him standing there with the truth dawning on him. The officer's jaw tightened, a flicker of tension crossing his face. It's not that easy." Damon nodded, his gaze calm but firm. It doesn't prove my innocence. The officer's shoulders slumped slightly. He knew Damon was right. Justice wasn't always black and white, and the system didn't always protect the people it was supposed to protect. Damon glanced back at the courthouse doors. He'd won his case, but this wasn't just a personal battle. It started with people speaking up, taking action instead of just standing by. The officer stood still for a moment, his eyes down and then up. The way he shifted on his feet, there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. "You know," he said, his voice quieter, almost a whisper, "not all of us are like her." Damon looked at him for a long moment before replying, his voice calm but not without challenge. "Then prove it." The officer nodded once, saying nothing more. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of people on the street, disappearing into the hustle and bustle of the city. Damon stood there for a moment, letting it all sink in. He had won, but this was only a small part of a larger battle. Too many people would never get a chance to stand trial, too many people without the knowledge, resources, or opportunity to fight back against injustice. That had to change. He pulled out his phone, his finger hovering over the screen before pressing the call button. A woman's voice came through the line, full of concern and love. "Damon? Is everything okay?" He smiled softly. "Yeah, Mom. Everything's okay." She exhaled, relief laced in her voice. "Good. I've been praying for you all morning." Damon leaned against the railing, his eyes scanning the streets below, where life went on, where people were still fighting their own battles. He took a deep breath. "Mom, I think I know what I want to do next." A pause. "Oh." He nodded, knowing she couldn't see. "I want to start something, maybe a legal defense fund. For people who don't have the means to fight back." His mother's voice softened. "It's a big job, honey." He smiled, his eyes shining with determination. "Yes, but I think it's the right thing to do." She was quiet for a moment, and then finally, a soft voice spoke in his ear. "I think you're right." Damon shoved his phone back into his pocket. He had walked into the courtroom as a defendant. He walked out as something else. Something more. Because today wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about making sure the next person falsely accused wouldn't have to fight alone. And that was a battle worth fighting.